Anyone Who Had a Heart by Mia Dolan. Read by Annie Aldington. Chapter 1. 1967. The first thing Marcie Brooks had noticed about Father Justin O'Flanagan was his eyes. They bulged slightly, and his pale pupils were fringed with yellow, like watery egg yolks. On that first meeting, she'd been only 11 years old, and still under the impression that only devils had yellow in their eyes. The fact that a priest owned such eyes was worrying, and made her suspicious that hell and all its wickedness had infiltrated the Holy Church. From that moment on, she tried to avoid looking at him, always hanging her head rather than facing him head-on. She knew he was coming today. Her grandmother had informed her as such. And although she told herself she was a big girl now, the memory of those eyes had stayed with her. "There's nothing to be afraid of. He's just a man," she whispered to her baby daughter. Joanna was lying pink and sleeping, dark lashes flickering as she dreamed her innocent dreams. Looking at her, Marcie was reminded of Johnny, her baby's father. Their love had been short-lived, but very sweet, cut short by an accident on the North Circular, when Johnny's motorcycle had collided with a lorry. If he'd lived, they would have married, and Joanna would have had a father. As it was, Marcie had been left an unmarried mother, and had to return home to Sheppey to live with her grandmother. Not that Father Justin was aware of that fact. Her grandmother had lied on her behalf, saying that Marcie's husband had been killed. "I'm sure the Holy Mother will forgive me," she exclaimed after crossing herself. "And Father Justin is not the sort to indulge in idle gossip." Marcie hoped she was right. She was having this baptism done for her grandmother's sake. Her days of church-going had stopped years before, and the thought of going to confession in the sure knowledge that Father Justin was on the other side of the screen filled her with horror. Some day she might feel differently, but not now. "Just to please your great-grandmother," she said to the sleeping child. Marcie had been through a lot in the last year. At times, since Johnny's death, she'd even found herself questioning what sort of God would have taken her baby's daddy away from her. "But we won't say a word to Granny, will we? We'll do this just for her." She smiled lovingly at the baby, at the same time as a pain tightened in her chest. "And you are like your father," she said, softly stroking the pretty pink cheek of the child she so loved. Thinking of Johnny brought other memories flooding back. One above all others she tried to block from her mind. She'd been foolish enough to trust her friend's father as a shoulder to cry on. Her trust had turned out to be ill-judged. He'd taken advantage of her naivety and inexperience. For a while, she'd even feared that the child might be his. He'd certainly been convinced of it. There was no longer any doubt about that in her heart. Joanna was the spit of her father. She'd never pressed charges against Alan Taylor, her friend's father. It was her word against his after all. And she did have something to be grateful to Alan for. If he hadn't come and collected her from the home for unmarried mothers, Joanna would have been given up for adoption. So far, since coming back to Sheppey, she'd managed to avoid him. However, this particular meeting could not be avoided. Her grandmother, Rosa Brooks, had been born on a Mediterranean island where the Catholic Church was as necessary to life as the air itself. Following her marriage to a handsome, though slightly irresponsible sailor in the British Royal Navy, Rosa Brooks had exchanged the Mediterranean island of Malta for the island of Sheppey. Her visits to the confessional and the Mass were reduced to once a week. She'd never forced Marcie or the rest of the family to attend if they didn't want to. Marcie didn't want to, but special occasions could not be avoided. "Joanna must be baptized," exclaimed her grandmother. Marcie couldn't argue with that. She didn't want her darling daughter to bear any of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?